Hi, my name is Tina Takish. I'm one of your classmates in the assessment seminar, and I'm going to just review some of the content from the Razzulli article as it related to fairness in grading classroom assessments. Now, if you feel like you took really copious notes on that anchor article, or you have a good handle on the themes that appeared specifically in the article, you can go faster through this presentation. I'm also posted online if you want to review it there, but I'll just go over these pretty quickly. So again, I'm going to review kind of some of the high level stuff from the article and then talk about the findings on fairness and grading, and just give you a snapshot of what to expect in the module that you're going to look at on grading and fairness in classroom assessment. So again, the anchor article we looked at earlier this week, was the Razzulli article entitled Reconceptualizing Classroom Assessment Fairness, a systematic meta-ethnography of assessment literature and beyond. So they did, meta-analysis of all these different research studies and articles to kind of glean themes about fairness as it related to classroom assessment. So why does this matter? Why does fairness matter in general? There are both positive effects of fairness and negative effects of unfairness that not only affect learning, but can affect students' health. It can affect their affective disposition towards school, which can impact their long-term success. Things like truancy and aggression pop up if there's perceived unfairness. And what's interesting in particular as it relates to grading and fairness with classroom assessments is that teachers are not well aligned in their beliefs on grading practices. Some teachers might grade homework, some might not grade homework. And so, I worked for a larger school system where there were clear policies about grading practices, but the enforcement of those policies was very weak, and knowledge about them was weak as well. So that's something that we'll talk about more later in this module. So again, what is classroom assessment? We're not talking about standardized assessments. We're talking about the assessments teachers use to collect data as evidence of student learning, and then they use that data for both formative and summative purposes. And I like that the article revisits this definition of formative assessment as assessment for learning. Formative assessment will come up later in a couple of articles in regards to fairness, because of the nature of formative assessment as being more of a practice opportunity to apply learning to new situations or different problems. And, grading formative assessment can be kind of a controversial thing when you look at whether or not it contributes to score error and score pollution. So the two key priorities of classroom assessment are to support student learning, and given the integral nature of assessment to teaching, it's important to take in consideration all the environmental dimensions of classrooms. So those are kind of two key things to think about when we talk about classroom assessment. So what were the findings on fairness from the Razzulli article? What did they have to say about classroom assessment as it comes to grading and fairness? There were three high-level themes that appeared in kind of two parts of this section on grading and fairness, and they were the themes of transparency, consistency, and justification. And they saw the article and the studies saw in their meta-analysis that these were themes that appeared as it related to fairness in grading and classroom assessment. And some contributing factors to fairness included clear learning and assessment expectations, rationales for objectives and criteria, so making it clear to students why certain objectives and criteria are included as part of grading, effective communication. That comes up again in the next slide here because the study authors talk about the difference between having clear expectations and then communicating those expectations, and sometimes there's a breakdown that leads to issues of fairness. Providing justification for criteria, it kind of aligns with the rationales portion of this, but making sure that students know why certain things are included or not included in an assessment as it relates to grading, and then consistent application of criteria. And that's something that we don't necessarily see given some of the differences between teachers and their opinions on grading and what should and should not be included. So that happens across students and across groups. So a little warning about transparency from the Razzulli article. I thought it was interesting. Like here I highlighted already, they talk about how transparent criteria can help improve fairness in classroom assessment, but communicating about that criteria is just as important as having it, because having criteria that is not well communicated also leads to issues of unfairness and error in scoring and score pollution. And we're really trying to get at what student's level of mastery is for the purposes of informing the learning process, right? It's not supposed to be a gotcha. And they also talk about how, if we're doing really backwards design in our assessment planning process, identifying clear criteria, success criteria for grading is important, but when that is narrowed down to a few things, there's a possibility of narrowing learning. And I know in articles I've read previously, this often happens with students who may not be at accelerated academic levels. And so it's important to keep in mind that like it says here, consistency is going to be key when it comes to grading and assessment as well. So we also have transparency without consistency across students or groups can threaten fairness in grading. Perhaps a teacher might think that, they're teaching middle school and they're, some of their non-accelerated classrooms need a lot of scaffolding when it comes to understanding grading criteria, but that level of detail is not provided to more advanced learners, and that affects their grades and how they perform on assessments because they're not clear on the grading criteria. So that's a little warning about transparency. Now, the article does also highlight feedback as an opportunity to provide fairness, and issues of unfairness come up as well. But they say that there's a need for more research in this domain. They say that some features of fair feedback include, again, transparency, justification, and consistency. And that makes me think of, perhaps there's a student who we're apt to give a lot of feedback to students who maybe aren't meeting success criteria, but what do we do for students who are, that, making sure that we provide consistent feedback and to all students. And then other influences in fairness related to feedback include respectfulness, equitable distribution, body language, and tone. But again, more research is needed in this domain. Feedback is something that's going to pop up again in our articles we're going to look at later this week because of the nature of formatives and homework and some of the opinions about whether or not those should be graded in terms of fairness. And it seems like some experts in the field believe feedback is actually a great replacement for grading those items, and it improves the fairness of the grading system when it comes to classroom assessments. So more on feedback will come up soon. Another important domain when it comes to fairness in classroom assessment is to avoid score pollution. And score pollution is related to introducing error into an assessment by kind of getting away from a true score. So it says here, score pollution has two dimensions: avoiding score pollution, meaning excluding factors that are construct irrelevant, and then excluding factors that underrepresent the construct. So, not including things like effort would be one way of isolating score pollution. And then another thing might be, making sure that you're assigning an assessment or, you're grading assessments that students can experience success in because they're not, encountering a bias related to their own personal experience or lives. So here are 6 things that the Rassouli meta-analysis came up with when it comes to improving score validity and reliability and avoiding pollution. So it says here that grades should exclude factors that are not related to constructs of achievement, and teachers need crystal clear policies to guide scoring practices, especially because they are not aligned on what they believe should and should not be included in grades. So it says in the article that bias is easier to isolate, but we need to be mindful to eliminate error related to effort, progress, compassion, teaching life lessons, etc. That grading for learning, unless you're teaching a class related to academic skills or a specific skill building related to effort or participation, that including those skills can be a source of score pollution when it comes to more subject-based assessments. Students perceive unfairness when teachers base grades on limited or insufficient data. So having a large scope of data to pull from when it comes to grading is important to students to have fairness. Assessment method can also pollute scores. If you're requiring students to do a dramatic monologue related to some historical event and they don't know what a monologue is, or they're not comfortable public speaking, and so choice eliminates some of those issues. And then group grading is also identified in the article as an issue of fairness. In particular, they talked about group composition and how if you have, it's good to kind of keep students with others who are in their zone of proximal development, who are in the same kind of academic sphere as they are, performance level, because what you'll see is, if a higher level student goes to join a lower level group, that there's bias in the grading that may drag down the grade of the higher level student and won't reflect their mastery. And the same thing if you have a kind of a student who's less advanced academically, joining a group of academically advanced students, then their mark might be inflated and not be a true representation of their mastery. So avoiding score pollution is important. So we're moving on from reviewing kind of the pieces of fairness that were in the Rassouli article to just talk a little bit about what to expect in the module. So in the module, you're going to do a little activity to start, an anticipatory activity. Then you'll look at some readings, some interesting readings from some experts on assessment and grading, and then you'll watch a couple of videos. Then you'll read an article about some grading systems such as standards-based grading or even the ungrading movement, and then talk a little bit about ChatGPT and whether or not that leads to fairness in grading. Okay, thank you.